Fundamentally, first we have to get out of this like experiment for everything mindset. Like sometimes you don't need it because you just like, why are you experimenting with everything? You need to have clear goal on, I am trying to do X. And if X doesn't work, then it doesn't matter if Y works because I'm trying to do X.
Like you said, the three-way marketplace complexity is it could win on one side, but could lose on the other two sides. So how do you go about tackling that?
I think ultimately the customer is key. And I think even in 0 to 1 projects, we execute 0 to 1 projects all the time. My teams do.
The first time you're doing the OKRs, you don't get it right. The second time maybe okay. The third, fourth time you're actually seeing what are the things you're trying to move the needle to.
Hey everyone, welcome to our podcast Everything Product. In this podcast, we talk about product management concepts and latest technology insights. Today, we're going to continue our conversation with Vishal, who is a Senior Director of Product Management at Shipt. This is a part 2 of this episode. If you guys have not watched part 1, please go ahead and watch using the above link. So let's get started. One of the questions which I had was, how do you incorporate this experimentation to optimize all this within the product development process today?
I think experimentation, personally, so there is a scientific, definition of experimentation. What is an experiment? How do you design it? There's a methodology. I mean, you mentioned, Shri, that there are talks, right? So I've done some talks. There are different ways of running an experiment. What is good in what scenario? What doesn't work in what scenario, etc. Right? Like for marketplaces, there is a certain way when you're in a complex 2 to 3-sided scenario. Certain ways of experimentation work, certain doesn't, certain don't. So there is that, the science part of, whether we are doing it. But I think to simplify, experimentation is, it's maybe it is sometimes sold as a very complicated or arcane skill, right? Like it's something complex. Only people who have like a math background or a stats background have access to what is experimentation, like things like that. But I think ultimately experimentation is just very simple bread and butter of what we do, what our operations team do, what everybody does, just to run a business. And here's the basic thing. The basic thing of what you do, what you're trying to do is when you try something new, when you have a new idea, it's an upgrade to what you're doing. It's a completely new idea which has never been tried before, whatever that may be, right? Or you're fixing a bug or whatever. Even if you're fixing a bug, right? Ultimately, what it comes down to is how confident are you that you can basically blast this to everybody, all of your audience, or do you don't have that confidence 100% that you just want to blast it to all of your audience and you want to actually try on some of them and then see what their reaction is and basically then try on a little more of them. Either you keep going or you basically say, no, we want to do something else. That's the basic concept, right? We throw the fancy word of experimentation, how you do it, so on and so forth. The basic idea is that what is your confidence that you can actually just like land this, you can do a big bang release, or you're not fully confident 100% there that what you have built is basically, is exactly what the customers want. And by the way, like when you have that confidence, you know exactly what your customers want. You have read their mind, right? Because, you are sitting here, you've read their mind, right? So, you know what they want. So one example I'll give you, simple example. If you were to reduce the cost, right? Let's say, some platform has delivery fees. I'm making this a very, very simple example, right? Let's say it's $4.99 for delivery. And forget about the orders, the type of orders and all. Let's ignore the details. I think you can very easily assume if you reduce that delivery fees from $4.99 to $3.99, your demand will increase. There's no need to experiment. There's no need to experiment. Like this is just obvious human behavioral psychology, behavioral finance. Like this is how people behave. When you give things for cheaper, more people will want to buy it. There's nothing to experiment here. Now, the question is, if you have weird combinations you're trying, right? Which is, I want to give them a discount, but I want to charge them for something else. I want to make some items in what they're doing more expensive. The others are lesser. But guess what? I'm actually giving them an overall discount. Those things, do you have 100% confidence of what combination works? Then you have to experiment. Because you're trying combinations, trying to figure out what items in that out of that $4.99, you're reducing $1. You want to take that dollar out somewhere. Maybe you increase the cost of some items, you decrease the cost of the others. So which items do you increase? Which items do you decrease for making that $1 up? Like that's something you need to experiment with, because you know what people are buying, and that also you can potentially look at your historical patterns and you can kind of like make a guess. But you need to do that, right? Like to, you know, as it gets more and more nuanced, you actually need to experiment, because you're truly in an unknown territory where you don't know for certain combinations how your market, how your audience will react, how your customers will react. But basically that's what experiment is. Like, you know, if the experiment, if somebody said that, you know, I want to experiment, you know, our app is not loading, it's crashing right now, I want to run an experiment to fix that bug and see whether it loads for, you know, for so many. I'm like, this is dumb, right? Like, you don't have to experiment.
Yeah.
Roll it out. Like, this is not an experiment. It's a bug. I mean, we know that the app is not loading. There's no like 10% of the audience or whatever. Test it in-house. It fixes it. Test it on all the devices that you can. You know, it fixes it. There was some, you know, something that we pushed forward, and now we're rolling it back or fixing it. Roll it out. There's nothing to experiment with. So that's, I think, fundamentally, first we have to get out of this like experiment for everything mindset. Like sometimes you don't need it, because you just like, why are you experimenting with everything? But that said, I would say that 95% of the 95% of the situations are not where you're trying to do something so obvious, right? Where, you know, it's clear as day that you don't need to experiment. In that case, then you start thinking about, okay, now there are some experimentation techniques, I've talked about in the past as well. The classic experimentation technique is A/B test, right? Which is, what you're doing is you are taking an A/B test, and that experiment can happen on anything. So in our case, we talked about the 3 sides. So you could split. A/B is basically a split test. You know, you're splitting the audience or splitting X between 2 sides, right? So you could split either the customers, the incoming customers, like half of the customers see something, the other half doesn't. Let's say if you split 50-50, right? Or 10% of the customers who see something, 90% wouldn't. 90% is status quo. They see what's happening today. 10% see something new that you're trying, a new idea that you don't have confidence. You could do that. You could actually split on the orders itself. The customers all see the same thing, but the orders are slightly different. Like the way, you know, one order is treated versus the other order. So if you split it on orders, then you're not really splitting it on people, because one customer, if they place 10 orders, they might see for 5, like if you're splitting 50-50, 5 of the orders would be experimented, 5 of the orders would. So as a member, as a customer, you may not see that impact, because you're seeing an average across the experiment and non-experiment. But internally, we have actually split on orders. We can measure impact on what happened to split these orders versus that. I'm making this up. You could do that. You could actually split on the supply side, which is half of the gig workers get this, half of the gig. It depends on what you're trying to do. I'll give you an example. So A/B test is sort of the bread and butter cookie cutter experimentation technique. People do that all the time. I would say that, again, I would come back to one thing I'll say very quickly, and then I'll come back to some more advanced techniques. I think the word experimentation sounds sexy, honestly, and it's fine that it does. But I think it's just common sense that before you roll out, like I said, if you don't have the confidence, before you roll out, you're going to try on a small percentage of your audience to see how they are reacting to something that you don't have very high confidence that this is how they're going to react. So, and again, the reason I say experimentation sounds like a fancy word is, you start with 10%, and then even if let's say you have 90% confidence, and then you look at the metrics, right, like adoption or whatever that is, and you're like, okay, 90%, I had 90% confidence that most people would love this feature, and they are. Okay, now I tried it on 10% of the people, because I didn't want to just do it for 100%, because I wasn't 100% confident. I was 90% confident. So I tried it on 10%. Now I'm going to go to 20%. Now I'm going to go to 50%. So it's a way of saying that I'm running an experiment, but ultimately it's a way of ramping up a rollout. It's just a ramp, right? Like, so that's what I'm saying. Like, it's common sense. Like, the technique that you use is fine. There are many techniques that you use, but ultimately the principle of why you're using experiment is, you're using experiment as a way of trying something and either pulling back from it, or you want to keep going, and ultimately the experiment becomes your product. That becomes your product ultimately. So that's something that is important to keep in mind, and not get caught up in, A/B test versus, there are so many others I can name. But, it's like A/B test versus, we have so many fancy. We have synthetic control. We have, one thing is called switchbacks. And I can talk about some of them. For marketplace, the way you experiment is slightly different from what you do. A/B test, simple A/B tests don't work. But that's sort of the idea, is for people to understand experimentation is a means to an end. And it's a common sense thing. Like what technique you use it's that matters. But ultimately, why are you doing it? Because you are using an experiment to scale it up to everybody who's out there, to your audience, essentially.
I want to understand a little bit more there, right? So as product managers, like I'm sure like bunch of our viewers are product managers actually. So the thing that we start with is, hey, this is my hypothesis that if we do this, then I'm gonna look at this. And if we see that there is a 10% increase, 5% increase, then we consider that experiment as a successful experiment or a failure, and then finally like implement whatever is the feature. Like you said, the three-way marketplace complexity is it could win on one side, but could lose on the other two sides. So how do you go about tackling that?
So we did talk about prioritization, right? You have to be clear before you prioritize the experiment itself. I mean, the experiment is ultimately trying to drive a metric, right? It's trying to influence some number, some metric. Before you even ask your team as a PM that this is something we want to run, this is something we want to prioritize, you need to understand that's sort of the art of it. There's no science behind this, right? We talked about prioritization. It may impact some other sides, but what are we gaining by giving up something? And is it worth it? That is a business conversation. That's a soft conversation that no one metric or one number will actually answer for you. That's a business conversation, right? Which is you talk to your stakeholders. That's your influencing, negotiating skills. If you strongly believe that this is a right step for the business, you should be able to convince other people, right? And if your stakeholders are usually, nobody runs an experiment in a vacuum like a lone wolf, right? No, that doesn't happen. Usually you are operating in context and you are trying to improve the business. So then you need to bring your other people along, take their opinion, understand if they think this is something worth spending time and opportunity on, or are there other opportunities that you should be spending time on. So whether you prioritize that or not, and again, even when we design experiments, we actually have something called, the way we do it, by the way, is, or at least we try to do it really hard, is we have something called an expected outcome in the company. So even before you run the experiment, you have clear metrics on what you're trying to measure. Everybody has that. But what we try to do is you try to forecast after you ran the experiment, what would be the change in that metric? It's not like, I'll just try it and, if it works, it works. If it does, because then what happens is, then you might be like, oh, this metric isn't working, but that one is. So like, what was the goal of your experiment, right? You need to have clear goal on, I am trying to do X. And if X doesn't work, then it doesn't matter if Y works, because I am trying to do X. So you need to be clear about why you're doing it and basically work backwards. And if it doesn't work for X, it doesn't matter if Y works, because I'm not doing it for Y, right? It doesn't matter. That Y may have become extremely, a simple example, again, using pricing as an example. I have reduced I have run an experiment where all my delivery fees is basically zero. Well, everybody's happy, but it doesn't work, right? Like, it's not gonna, all my fees to zero, everybody's happy, but well, the business isn't going to sustain. It doesn't matter. So you need to make sure that you have a clear goal in mind. You need to make sure that you try to forecast before even you run. You look at history, you look at something similar you may have done. You try to look at something maybe online. There's so much literature available today. Somebody else may have done something similar. You try to do some napkin math in order to come up with a forecast. And by the way, this is us, this is us as PMs. We need to have this discipline. And I think in any experiment or any venture or any idea that you take, the skill of forecasting and being able to have a target, a goal target, set a target, and measure whether or not you're close to the target is something that differentiates, the best of the best from people who are just sort of like doing the job. Because guess what, right? Like you as a business, when you are listed on Wall Street, or you're listed, or your finance team, for example, they are constantly forecasting what the number of users will be next year. They're constantly forecasting what will be the revenue next year. So why shouldn't you as a PM do it when you are actually trying to run something? You should have that discipline. And then I think, you develop a deep understanding. When you try to say, and by the way, like sometimes the forecast is just made up, right? Like, I want to increase this metric by 2%. That's fine. You made it up. Even if you completely made it up, you didn't have any gut feeling or any justification. But at least when you ran it and you saw only a 0.5% statistic, only a 0.5% statistic improvement, you'd be like, what happened to the 1.5%? Like, why did I forecast that high? So that learning of being able to commit, being able to understand, and then basically driving really hard to understand what do I need to actually meet that commitment. That's super critical. So experimentation is a means to an end, long story short, right? These techniques, these things, that the discipline that you develop of how do you experiment, what do you look for, what users, if I'm doing it here, if I'm doing it for one set of users, how can that impact another set of users in my marketplace? Can I actually forecast to my best ability what after the experiment what the world would look like? Those are the things that are super important to become a very data driven, I would say.
Yeah.
Totally agree to that point, because forecasting is not easy. Like, it's
not.
very tough. And if you're not really driving the exact part, you might be a platform PM, or you might be a PM who's driving few other things. It's extremely difficult to have that customer mindset and get to that number. But if you can do that, yeah, that'll be awesome.
Right. But that's why I'm saying, right, people who understand that skill, when you understand that skill, now you are actually talking to your stakeholders. Because then you are telling your business stakeholders, well, there are 3 things we can do. One of them will give us a 5% lift on this metric. The other will give us a 2%. The other will give us a 1%. And guess what? When there are other PMs in the room who are like, I want to try X, then the business stakeholders are like, but this guy knows what he's doing. Or this girl knows what she is doing, right? They know. They can, with some confidence, non-zero confidence, they can tell me that they are at least attempting to move the metric by 5%. And then what happens is, then when prioritization discussions happen, they actually have an apples to apples comparison. Because if there is one metric, profitability metric, as an example, which is a top line company OKR, and everybody, you are in all hands. Everybody, all of us are in all of our all hands. We know what is important to the company. If you decide to take that and basically, reorient either some or all of your teams to actually reorient to that and try to solve and improve that metric, for example, nobody's going to say, as long as you can forecast and say, we think that we can improve the metric. The company wants to improve it by X%. We can improve it by X by 2, like 50% of X%, right? Nobody's going to come and stand in your way, but you need to be able to have that confidence. And once you promise, you need to deliver also. Otherwise, you're just making empty promises. And that is the worst way of losing trust, right? But you get the idea. As you do it more and more, then you're speaking the language of business stakeholders. Then they are able to see, okay, this metric is important for the company. There are these 3 things this team is doing. There are these 3 experiments they want to try. They think that they can influence the metric by so much by doing this. The other teams, they don't know. So who should we actually fund? Who should we not fund? Who should we sponsor? Who should we not sponsor? Where we have some non-zero confidence that, they are going to move this metric, versus the other team is like, we want to try X and let's see whether it moves the metric or not. We don't have a good handle on it. So it's very different.
No, makes sense.
Yeah,
Thanks for explaining.
Definitely. I think balancing multiple things, the risks, the rewards from the experiment is important. And I think you brought up some great points around what are our primary goals, secondary goals, what are the success criteria that we will be measuring against. I mean, the experiments, right? Otherwise, it's going to go forever, and we cannot do experiments forever. Our leadership is not going to be happy. So I think those are some of the important factors that to consider.
I think the key statement is: are you as a PM driven by outcome or output? I saw this visualization, this poster once, which stuck with me when I was an early PM. There was a poster of a rocking horse, right? You've seen the rocking horse, right? Wooden horse that rocks. And the statement was, there is a difference between movement and progress. And that stuck with me, right? Because you're making a lot of movement there, but you're not getting anywhere. So if you know what your goal is, and you are able to chart a goal, and you're able to chart an outcome, and then you will learn. As long as you have the drive and the discipline and the hunger to actually chart an outcome, versus, we'll figure out the outcome after we do something. That's a recipe for disaster. But if you can actually, it's not easy. Like you said, Sid, it's not easy to work backwards from an outcome where you don't know. You don't know, like you're just like in a vacuum. You don't know what the outcome is. You don't know what the forecast is. But still, using that's where the art of a product manager, the judgment, the intuition of a product manager comes into picture. How do you make some reasonable goal? And it's okay, like if you really put a stretch goal, that's the other thing about how should you set OKRs and all that, which is a different story. But even if you set a stretch goal and you failed, you should be able to convincingly stand in front of the team and say that, yeah, we didn't achieve that. But we did fail in doing that, for example. But we think that overall we didn't meet the stretch goal, but that doesn't mean we failed completely. Because we did make progress. We learned what it will take for us to actually get to the stretch goal as we were doing this. And that is more important than anything else.
Yeah, and some of the teams which I work with, right, that's what I said. Like the first time you're doing the OKRs, you don't get it right, the second time maybe okay. The third, fourth time you're actually seeing what are the things you're trying to move the needle towards the goal and all of that stuff. Yeah.
Correct, correct. It took us, I would say that, Shipt actually seriously started moving to OKRs while I was at the company. I've been at the company for just under 3 years at this point. It took us about 9+ months to get the whole company oriented, around 9 months, 6 to 9 months, the whole company oriented towards everybody is now, there's a planning process, there's a reporting process every quarter. Everybody is now trying to put some OKRs. And I would admit that not by the way, not all things are completely measurable also, right? Like let's make sure that you also don't get into a system where you are basically trying to, so it's always progress over perfection, right? You're not into a system where unless you can measure, you are not going to make progress. That's also not the right thing. So it is a judgment call, right? Like this is business. There's no like one way of doing business right or two ways of getting the business right. So it's not like you don't launch anything because you couldn't measure, as long as you have a strong intuition that this, for example, some tech debt, some bug, like some re-architecture, system re-architecture, you may or may not be able to say what is the impact on unit economics by re-architecturing a system. Doesn't mean you don't do it, right? So that's what I'm trying to say, is that there are projects. Sometimes you have to execute projects without having clear ties to the outcomes. In fact, I would say, in my experience, and actually this is I think a good, and I've never heard this before, but I'm saying this from my experience. So I would say that about 40%, 30 to 40% of, even in a very, very OKR driven company, 30 to 40% of the work that happens or projects that happen, milestones that are on the roadmap, are truly tied to some meaningful OKR. The remaining 60% are projects. And the reason I say that is, this. Let's say that, from last quarter to this quarter, the company has actually pivoted away and they have a new OKR. So they had a growth OKR last quarter. Now, growth looks fine. They have a huge number of users. Now they are trying to figure out how to monetize the users. So they have pivoted. So in this quarter, guess what? Some of the growth projects are still undergoing. The teams are not going to overnight wake up and say, whatever I was doing, I'm just going to stop doing that. Next day, like when the clock strikes 12, I'm immediately going to start working on it. It doesn't work like that. There's a transition period. So some of the, even naturally, there are some projects which are on the roadmap. You have to wind them up. You have to land them. And then so it takes some time for these things to happen. But even otherwise, I would say, 40% are the ones where basically the most innovation, the most pushing of the company, the most measurement, the most of that happens. And don't get caught up in like, I couldn't measure 100% for everything I did. Well, the 40% you did will be so much more impactful. And that's more than good enough to push yourself, push your teams, to push your company forward. So, that's what I'm trying to say as well, right?
Many times I've also seen features which are like 0 to 1. It's like, this is the feature needed.
Correct.
It comes from ops, customer success, etc. I can't really put an KR to it, but I'm just going to do it because it helps. I know that it helps.
No, I was just saying that it's a very interesting question, and I kind of touched upon it earlier. I think ultimately the customer is key. And I think even in 0 to 1 projects, we execute 0 to 1 projects all the time. My teams do. The one OKR is, we don't have an OKR. That's fair, because, we don't know what we're doing. It's the first time. But our OKR is to launch. So there are 0 to 1, like hit a deadline. So that's an OKR. We commit, we will get this done. We have the discipline of planning, going and talking to our engineering teams to estimate dev effort and all of that. So number one is what we promise on that day, we actually land. So that's progress. I would say that is also measurable progress, like doing when you say something will be done and the teams actually gelling and working together and all of them, that's progress, because that's a cultural thing. And the second thing is, we don't know, but there's always an adoption OKR. So the way I say it is, after we launch this, we will baseline adoption to say that so many users are actually, ultimately, see, the worst product or worst feature you can build is something that nobody uses ever. That's like the worst thing you ever build, right? Because you have wasted a bunch of time and effort and money in doing something that nobody cares about. So at least, number one, we hit the deadline. What the deadline was, the planning and the discipline of that. And number two is, out of that, we came out and we said that so many people, we think, or again, like I said, it might be difficult, but as much as you can try, you can look at other 0 to 1 launches that happened in the past, maybe something similar. You can say that within a week from now, a month from this, we expect so many users to actually continue using our product, to continue to use our product after about a month or so. So at least have that. And then again, there is a goal. And then if you don't meet the goal, you go back to the drawing board, like, what do I need to do? It's that discipline that is important. And if you do meet that goal or beat that goal, then it's like, maybe I was just under promising. Maybe the product is really much better than anything we have done before. But at least you have something to compare, right? So, that's sort of how you make progress.
Yep. Vishal, actually, I want to take a 360-degree turn here, right? Professional career, we all like do a lot of things, aim for a lot of things, achieve things. And you as a person, what I've seen, and when we met in the Product Tank event as well, right? You are very outspoken. Like, you are in the events, you try to mentor people. You are also an advisor on the advisory board for like multiple companies and stuff. So what I see this is growing our personal persona beyond the professional career that we're going with. So can you give us like what motivates you in doing that, and what would you give as an advice to other people to do this?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a good question. I think one thing that motivates me, and this is an honest answer, one thing that motivates me is in this space, in the space of podcasts, I'm doing this. I've done a bunch of different talks before. I actually believe that giving back is actually a way of gaining a lot of knowledge as well. So I have learned so much for free, honestly, from a lot of industry leaders in a lot of different podcasts, newsletters. I listen to them, and I have grown so much, especially through COVID, right, where everybody was confined in their homes, and the online channels, YouTube channels, and all that digital. It was a digital explosion, right? The number of the kind of content, amount of content that was being published. There's so much out there on investment, on product management, on business operations, on design, on this, on that. So I just find it very gratifying that I'm just able to learn from all these experts for free, honestly, right? Because there's so much knowledge out there that it has helped me grow. So the way I think about this is, it's my way of giving back, right? Which is, maybe I have some insights. I have listened to a lot of these ideas, but I have tried to use some of them into my own, in my own situation, in my own context, in my own company. And then what have I learned? Maybe those learnings are a little bit. Like, for example, one of the things that I tried to describe the marketplace 101, the unit economics, right? Supply demand. You guys may have seen that supply demand thing before, right? Like it's supply increases, demand increases with price, supply increases with price, demand increases with price. But I mean, one of the things that I realized is that for us, there is inventory. And if you try to plot that, and I try to do this, like if you actually try to plot that, there is no real equilibrium in the marketplace. There is no one balance point. And then you kind of understand. And, when you share that out with others, just one small example, right? And, another one that I just shared was 40% of your projects will have OKRs. Don't beat yourself up. 40% are the ones that matter. Don't obsess over why isn't everything that my teams are doing, everything is measured. Progress over perfection. 40% will get you very far, even if you get to 40%, right? So things like that, which I've learned through experience, I have not heard that, in other places. That is born out of my own working experience through my own teams, etc. And I feel like we should share that, right? Because, hopefully it is helping some other people grow, just like other people help me grow. So that's basically it.
I think our podcast also probably started in a similar way, like where we felt like, okay, we are not only sharing, but also learning at the same time and keeping us updated with what's going on around the world. Otherwise, I feel like, okay, we're not updated.
Yeah.
And the funny part was, even for our podcast, we are all product managers, right? We define OKRs. This is our quarterly goal for the podcast. This is our key results. How are we doing for the podcast and stuff?
Yeah. No, it's good to measure progress. Don't get me wrong. Yeah, I am hoping that so when you are setting OKRs, you have a forecast, right? Is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. See, that's what I'm trying to say, right? Agnostic of the problem space, whatever the problem space may be, that discipline is what is important. Again, we use the word experiments. I would say that if I, had a mom and pop store, right? Some small, medium business, mom and pop store, a general store, and I was selling things off my store, off the aisle. I would probably have I would have learned what an experiment is. I would have learned why do we experiment. I would try some experiments, physical experiments in my store. I would try to keep the store open during certain hours, closed during certain hours. Like, this is not different. It's just, how do you think about life? How do you think about, So I think that is something that I've learned a lot. Technology is just a manifestation of what human needs are ultimately, and that's what we're trying to solve that. Right? So.
Definitely.
Awesome. So we spent a lot of time discussing a lot of different topics. So normally we do like a trivia at the end, set of questions. Like let's maybe do that, and I'll hand it off to Srinath to wrap it up. So if I were to ask you, right, like what would be your favorite book or the book which you're reading now?
My favorite book, or you said favorite book or podcast? Is that what?
Or a book that you're reading currently?
Oh, sure. Okay. So I love reading. Personally, I love reading non-fiction books. I learn reading business books. I love learning. And I told you guys, reading is my vice. I try to read as regularly as I can. I just finished reading. This is a very old book, but I really loved it. It's called High Output Management by Andy Grove. He was the CEO of Intel. I heard about the book first time when I was listening to the CEO of Spotify, Tobias Lutke. And he was talking about how he was influenced through Andy Grove. Andy Grove was, just to give you guys a background very quickly, he was an Hungarian immigrant who came to the US. He founded Intel, started Intel, made Intel what it is, a common household name, all the Pentium processors, Pentium chips, etc. He was the CEO at the time when all of that was happening. He was the one who actually introduced OKRs at Intel. So they talk about something called MBOs, which is management by objectives. They don't call it OKRs, right? But anyway, this was in the 80s and 90s, I feel like, around that time. They talk about MBOs. So it's like the origin of how OKRs are, how did they plan. They talk about how do you structure, how do you level OKRs. For example, how does an OKR hierarchy work? What should your OKRs be? As a manager, what should your OKRs be? What should your reports OKRs be? How do they kind of level up? Is there a hierarchy, etc.? So it's a great book. It's old. It's a very classic. I love that. Now I'm actually reading something called Scaling People. Scaling People is by the ex-chief operating officer of Stripe. Her name is Claire Hughes-Johnson. She was actually not very long ago on Lenny's podcast. She was talking about her book as well. She was at Google for a while, and then she was the chief operating officer of Stripe. So, she also talks about routines, processes. I love process, by the way. Sidebar. I hate meetings. This is a very controversial statement. I hate meetings, but I love process because process doesn't equal to meetings, right? Process means you have a common understanding of how to get things done, which doesn't mean you have to meet all the time, right? But so that discipline and the protocol of like who does what, accountability is clear. That I love that. So she talks a bunch about that as well. How to scale people. Scaling people is the foundation of scaling everything else. Like if you scale people, processes can scale, companies can scale. People first, basically, is sort of the gist of the book. In terms of my personal favorites, I would say that my all-time favorite is Alice in Wonderland. I love that book. It's very creative. It's a very old book, obviously. Everybody has read it. But I love how every time I read it, I'm just like, it is so creative and so full of imagination that, somebody, Lewis Carroll, like wrote it so many years ago. Just like, I just love that book because of it's like truly like a no holds barred story. Like anything happens in that story, right? So I love that. There are obviously movies being made. So obviously the book is important and relevant even now, right? Movies are being made even now on that. So I love that. There is another one, last one, which is The Geek in Me. And these are books that I read a long time ago. So the other nonfiction book is sort of fiction nonfiction. So the other book it's called Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. So it's a weird title, but Richard Feynman was a physicist. He was a Nobel Prize winner at Caltech. And so they describe his life, how he was it's written as an autobiography. It was a narration, but it's written in first person. But I know that, the thing is that it's written not by Richard Feynman, it's written by somebody else, but it's written in first person. So it's a biography, narrated biography, essentially. He talks about how he was as a kid. He used to love tinkering. He was apparently a very funny character as a person. And he used to love like breaking locks and breaking into other people's homes, for example. So things like that. He talks about that. He talks about like gambling, because everything is ultimately maths and physics, right? Like, so he was obviously a big abstract thinker because he got a Nobel Prize. Things like that. So it's very inspirational, to read read about these books. I generally like reading about people. I think the one that I am reading right now, non-fiction that I'm reading non-fiction about people, not business, is I'm reading President Obama's biography, The Audacity of Hope. So that's also sort of, I'm in the middle of it, so I don't have an opinion.
Audacity of Hope. Yeah, I've read that. Yeah. Oh, awesome. Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Science. It's always good to share books and see how that inspired you. So to my next question, like, what is your favorite podcast or go-to podcast?
Sure, there are a few. Of course, I love yours. I have to say that.
Thank you. Thanks for that.
Yours is great, and I've seen the episodes. Obviously, right? I've seen past guests. So I love that. I love how the conversations are so candid. It's very easy. It's very easy to kind of bring out nuances with you guys, especially the panel format that you guys have, where somebody may go deep and somebody may bring you back to the surface, for example. So I love that. Versus with a single interviewer, it can basically become set agenda sometimes, right? Versus you guys, it's a little more. It feels like it's a little more free balling, a little bit more, which is great. I love Lenny's. I think it speaks for itself because it's one of the top 3 podcasts on Apple and Spotify right now. He literally built it, in the last 2 or 3 years, and he has all the product leaders. And Claire Hughes-Johnson was actually on his podcast recently. So I love learning. I have learned a lot from that podcast, from all these business leaders. I used to love How to Solve It by Guy Raz. This was before COVID. He used to do a podcast for New York Times, I believe, and he used to go and talk. That's where I heard about the book High Output Management, because he interviewed Tobias Lutke. So he used to interview How I Built It. I'm sorry, it's not How I Solved It. How I Built It. So he goes to original founders. So he had, for example, Collison brothers from Stripe. So he talked to them. He had Shopify CEO. So he used to go to, and he's a New York journalist, I believe. So he used to run a podcast there. So I love that. And I think the last one that I like is it's not very frequent, unfortunately, but the episodes that have been released, I have found them pretty deep and insightful. There is one by a VP from Facebook. His name is Nikhil Singhal, and his podcast is called The Skip. He's not releasing a lot of it because he's busy, I guess. The Skip, yeah. But and I think the theme of the podcast is, if you were to move to your skip level, what would you need to do? How would you need to think in order to get to a skip level job? Not your manager's job, but a skip level job. I think that's the idea. So I've learned a lot from that as well. Unfortunately, he doesn't release a lot, but I'm thankful for whatever he does release. I don't know him personally, but I've learned from that podcast.
Thanks for those humbling words about our podcast. And yeah, I know we are also big fans of Lenny's podcast. And also the reason why we started the podcast is, right, like, product management is more of an art than science. And there's like a lot of hidden gems where people collect through experience and the job they do. So especially all of the stories you shared, right, could benefit a lot of other product managers, which you can't find in any book or any framework, right? Awesome. So I'll wrap it up with the last question, right? If you were to mention, what is your favorite movie, Bollywood or Hollywood, whichever it is?
Sure. I saw a Bollywood movie after a long time when I'm right now in India, as you guys know. And I saw one right before I left for India. And I hadn't seen a Bollywood movie in a long time, but I mean, this is recency bias, right? This is also, as PMs, we think about recency bias. So this is an example of that. I saw it and then I liked it so much, I saw it again the next day. It is a 3-hour long movie, so that's saying a lot. I don't really watch Bollywood movies. It's called Rocky Aur Rani Ki Prem Kahani. It's a Hindi movie. Yeah. It's about these two guys who fall in love. Yeah. Two different families, they fall in love. It's a very cliche Hindi movie, but I really enjoyed it. I think one of my all-time favorites, English movie, again, this is the geek in me. One of my all-time favorites is The Beautiful Mind. A Beautiful Mind, right? From, Russell Crowe. This was about John Nash, the economist, game theory and things like that. So that's also one of my favorites.
Yeah, I liked Rocky and Rani.
as well.
Nice. It's a total masala movie, right? Hindi masala movie, and it's like a lot of entertainment, songs, colors. So it was just like a break from reality. It was like an escapism movie. So I really liked it myself.
I love the Rocky Randhawa's character. He's like always in there, always energetic. Yeah.
He's always plugged in, He's always plugged in.
That
Yeah,
feels like a true Ranveer Singh's real life character.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
definitely.
really like.
I'm not sure if you guys watched a recent The Coffee with Karan, where
Yeah,
him and Deepika were there, and he was talking about a lot of his the energy levels and all that stuff. So,
I don't
um,
usually follow like a lot of Hindi anything, honestly. Like I think I saw a Bollywood movie after probably 2 years, but it was really good, and I was like, yeah, I had to see it again the next day. I usually don't like. I'm in India and I'm not really watching TV at all. But yeah, it's,
that's awesome. Yeah, I know. I mean, it's been amazing the session listening to your insights into experimentation, three-way marketplace, which are pretty challenging. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you viewers out there will be benefited from all the strategies, tips that you gave. Maybe before we end our podcast, uh, any last piece of advice that you would give for the aspiring product managers out there?
yeah. I would say the only recent piece of advice I would say now is actually listen to all these podcasts. It's an incredible wealth of information, right? Uh, some of the ones that I mentioned, and learn for yourself. There is no real school of product management. There's no one degree. There are degrees now. Carnegie Mellon has one, I think. There are a couple, but my point is that the real, uh, what does it take to do the job? There are so many moving pieces. It takes a while to get it right, to find your feet and find your groove, and the self confidence that you are doing it right. I have lived in imposter syndrome for a long time. I lived in it. Today, when I hire, new team members or hire new people, my first statement to them is, you forget the imposter syndrome out the door. You are here because you belong, right? So maybe you don't feel it. Maybe you have things to prove. That's fair, and we understand. It's a good thing to not take things for granted. So it's good that you feel that way. But as far as we are concerned, if I feel, for example, that I need to coach you somewhere, I will. If I don't, and I'm absent, that doesn't mean that I'm ignoring you. It means that I have trust in you. So you just go do your thing, right? So that is the only piece of advice I would give, is listen to other people, learn from them, try to understand. This is definitely not a one size fits all. It's a complicated job. It's difficult to even understand what is a good product manager, but it takes a few years of persistence, of being there, even if things are tough, even if things are unclear. It takes a few years of being there in order to understand, like, what does it take to actually get to the next level.
Definitely. I think, I mean, like product management is not like, oh, go and learn a C language or a C++ language and do it.
Right.
It's like more art and science involved, like a lot of problem solving and all that stuff, right? And I think that product management continues to evolve. And the way we keep updated is listening to podcasts or reading books and all that stuff.
Exactly.
That's an awesome advice. So maybe with that being said, we will end this podcast. I know we spent close to 1.5 hours on this. We would highly thank you for your time in your busy schedule. I'm sure in India it's more busy and stressful. So we highly appreciate you taking time, and looking forward for more future engagements.
Yeah, this was a very, very engaging conversation, is all I want to say. I said it before. I think this was very natural. I think the conversation, it was like, like a little river. It flowed wherever it flowed. And you guys just allowed me to ramble on a few times, I think. I hope that the insights were helpful.
Yeah.
I hope they were not disconnected from what the questions were. And I hope that, they were on point. But it was very natural. It felt very easy. So definitely keep the format up. I appreciate you guys having me. Last thing I'll say, if your audience wants to connect with me, I would love to, as you mentioned, Shri, Sid, and Funny, I love to mentor. I love to give back to the community. If anybody wants to connect with me, my LinkedIn is linkedin.com/in/VEE. It's just VEE, 3 letters. So find me on LinkedIn, add me. If there's anything else that I can do to be helpful, I'd definitely love to give back. So,
Yeah.
In the description and stuff. Yeah.
sounds good. Yeah, it was great
Definitely.
being here. Thank you so much for your time.
Definitely. Thanks for the kind note there. And yeah, for all the viewers out there, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and watch this video.
Thank you.
Yeah.